You know, in the 1950s, a whole genre of fiction came about, lesbian pulp fiction. And our next guest, author Monica Nolan, knows all about it. Monica, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, what was the book that created, as it were, this genre?
That would probably be Women's Barracks by Teresa Torres, who just died, I mean, in her 90s, just a little while ago.
And that was in 1950?
And that was in 1950, and the reason it made pulp fiction such a big deal is that it was criticized in Congress. Somebody cited it as an example of, and that just brought a huge amount of attention to it. It became a huge bestseller, and publishers were wanting to replicate that success.
Well, you as a successful author have replicated and improved upon the brand, but you've kind of gone back with some very retro art covers here. I love this.
Yes.
The Big Book of Lesbian Horse Stories. When the Sapphic sisters saddle up, ecstasy is only a hoofbeat away.
Yes.
Or Bobby Blanchard, lesbian gym teacher. That's pretty good and very campy.
Yeah.
And then Maxie Mainwaring, Lesbian Dilettante. She had experience in everything except employment.
Yes.
But my personal favorite, this is just a stitch. Lois Lynn's lesbian secretary. Her soul was pure, her desires were sinful, her typing was impeccable.
Yes.
I mean, these are campy.
Yeah, they're very campy. I mean, what I wanted to do when I wrote them was to save the good parts of the pulps, which are sort of the melodrama, the soap opera, the sex, and lose the less appealing sort of self-hating, why am I this way parts that were.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if we hadn't had pulp lesbian fiction, we wouldn't have had something like Deborah Carr and Shirley MacLaine and Tea and Sympathy.
Yeah.
Not Tea and Sympathy.
You're thinking of the Children's Hour.
The Children's Hour,
yes.
where at the end, of course, all they have to do is die.
Yes. Well, one of them commits suicide, and the other is reunited with the man, which is the classic lesbian ending.
Right.
Yeah. Mental institution, suicide, murder, accidentally having a tree fall on you, which is what happened in D.H. Lawrence's. Yeah.
You know, it's not the Yellow Brick Road.
No. No. They say, and it's like even when they started having happy endings in the pulps, it's like, oh my God, these are the happy endings. They're like, you know, the woman loses her child, you know, to her husband.
Yeah.
You know, it's always a lot of Sturm and Drang.
So I mean, would we have had Basic Instinct without Women in Barracks? What was it?
Women's Barracks.
Women's Barracks. Would there have been Basic Instinct without Women's Barracks?
That's a good question. I don't think so. You know, that's a really good point, because I always think that, you know, we think of lesbian pulps as something from the 50s and 60s, but they're still around. The L Word was complete lesbian pulp.
And pulpy and frothy and just kind of edgy.
Yeah, just a lot of soap opera. I mean, except again in this modern era where women are comfortable being out, which is what's new and different.
Right.
And
So now, what was the first lesbian pulp novel you read?
The first lesbian pulp novel I read was one of the Anne Bannons, and I remember it. I was in a college. It was in college. I was in my dorm room with a bunch of friends. It was late at night, and we pulled a trashy book off the shelves of, like, you know, detective novels, Harlequins, and we pulled this book off. We started reading it out loud, and we were like, oh my God, this is hilarious! And we were acting it out. It was so campy, and of course that was
were you out as a lesbian at that time?
No, I wasn't, but I hung around with all the lesbians. So.
You were a lesbian by extension.
I was a lesbian by extension. It was really the formalities had not been concluded, but it was pretty. I mean, the place I went, it was a women's college, and it, you know, everybody was lesbian, right? Not all of them.
Well, I would imagine that.
It was
I mean,
Bryn Mawr College.
Well, I mean, you should have just, like, come out before you applied. But I mean, I can imagine that Bryn Mawr is closeted by name in more than one lesbian pulp novel of the 50s and 60s.
Oh, that's probably, I think you're right. I do think you're right. I mean, they're all the lesbian poets who went there.
Right.
There's a, anyway.
There's a
I'm getting off topic.
No, you're not. It's all about the topic, because I remember as a young boy, you know, knowing I was gay, but because I was intellectual, I would go to the library.
Right.
And every now and then I would find a book. And I knew it wasn't about men, but just because of the cover art, and I knew the word lesbian, I was like, ooh, well, it's not about men, so maybe it's safe. I don't have to go to confession if I read that. But I was like, this is kind of racy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not into the woman thing, but I'm
getting it. But
it's
like, you know, that's really funny, because I always remember reading when I was coming out, I was working at a bookstore and reading some gay teen novel that I was just like, oh, this is totally turning me on. And I think it's like there is a displacement that happens where
Yeah.
it feels much safer to read about some other
Right,
same-sex
so
relationship.
you're reading the pulpy, you're reading Gordon Merrick novels, and right, Gordon
Yeah.
Merrick, probably the gay male version of.
I don't know him. I'll have to look
Well,
him
a
up.
lot of his covers were
like that,
this.
yeah.
But we talked a little bit about how literature has formed our ideas of being LGBT. How did lesbian pulp fiction form your identity, or did it?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it was sort of, it formed it in an oppositional way. It's like, oh my God, I'm not like that, except it's kind of am. And I think that's one of the things I'm interested is looking at the similarities between that time and our time. And in the books, it's, I mean, I have the whole parody element, but I also have, they're modern stories. They're stories about girls growing up and finding careers and finding girlfriends and how that process is, and that process hasn't changed.
Right.
So, yeah.
Now, we've mentioned this title 3 times, and so now I'm going to have to find it. Barracks.
Women's Barracks.
God, sorry,
Women's Barracks.
Now, you said the author actually, until recently, was still alive. She died in her 90s.
Yeah, and she was married. She was a straight lady. And Women's Barracks is also did what a lot of pulps did that back then, which is they had a tiny lesbian episode in it.
Right.
So I'm right now, one of the things I have on my website is I have a blog where I read lesbian pulps and write about them, sort of give a little capsule reviews and summaries. And tons of them, you slog and slog and slog, and you're like, where are the lesbians? And there's like in one little chapter.
Well, of course, one of our most famous lesbian scenes in literature was written by the former Second Lady of the United States, Lynn Cheney.
I still haven't read that.
When I was working at the NEA, and she was the head of the NEH, and we're all like, did you know Lynn Cheney wrote a really steamy lesbian scene? It was like, no, but I'm going to find it now. And then, of course, P.D. James.
Right. I didn't know that.
One of the great mystery writers of all time, my favorite author.
No, I know her as a...
Same thing, wonderful mystery writer, and every now and then you'll be like, where did that steamy lesbian scene come from? You're like, Petey, you didn't, something we don't know about you.
Yeah.
In our last few moments, talk to me about what it is that keeps you writing. I mean, you're churning out quite a number of books.
Oh, it's super fun. I've created this whole world of...
And you have video, too. I mean...
I have video. That was my first foray into lesbian pulp, was to imagine if there had been a movie made in the 50s of one of these pulps, what would the trailer have looked like?
Right.
And so I made, that was my first thing. But it's cheaper to write than to make movies.
So the reason you're an author and not a filmmaker is?
Pretty much. It's paper and pen are much cheaper than film or video nowadays, or cameras and editing time and all that business.
So what's next for you? What's the next book?
The next book is Dolly. It's going to be about Dolly Dingle, and it's going to kind of be the midlife crisis career girl book. So she's going to switch careers, and it takes place in the Magdalena Arms where the girls are all living. So there are a lot of recurring characters in it. And
the Magdalena Arms, is that a Catholic school?
That's the boarding. That's sort of the rundown boarding house where the girls live.
Where Ann Baxter in All About Eve picks up the phone. Yeah, right.
Well, or Ginger Rogers.
Yeah, we've got some more to talk about. We've been speaking with Monica Nolan, author of many wonderful pulp books. I'm David Perry, host of 10%. See you next week.